Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest has written a book about what is arguably the most important free speech case of the entire era. I've been reading his work for many, many years. It's the first time we've actually, I think, gotten a chance to talk at length. Kevin Gosztola, let me spell that for you, Gosztola, is the author of a book, Truth and Consequences, the U.S. versus Private Manning, with Greg Mitchell. That came out in 2012. He is reported for a number of outlets, including Fire Dog Lake, where I wrote at one point, Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, Truth Out, Counterspin. He's been on that program, Democracy Now!, Real News, Al Jazeera English. And he has a weekly podcast, which he co-hosts, called Unauthorized Disclosure. He is the co-founder and managing editor of the website Shadow Proof, which I encourage you to read. And his new book is Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. So without any further ado, Kevin, welcome to the program.
Hey, it's good to talk with you, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Did I mangle your last name?
Oh, no, it's fine.
Okay, it's fine. All right. Okay. My name is phonetic, and all my elementary school teachers pronounced it wrong. So, Kevin, first of all, obvious question, but a good place to start, I think. What led you to write a book about the case against Julian Assange?
Yeah, so this book was the culmination of a lot of work that I've been doing. My start as a professional journalist was with an internship at The Nation magazine under Greg Mitchell during a formidable time, a time when WikiLeaks was putting out these diplomatic cables every week for about 5 or 6 months, truly had the U.S. State Department on edge. And then, of course, the prosecution of Chelsea Manning, the U.S. Army whistleblower who provided these documents to WikiLeaks, who was charged with multiple Espionage Act offenses, that was starting. And there was allegations and stories of abuse taking place at the Marine base Quantico, where she was initially held in detention. And I decided to plow into this and really throw myself into reporting on these documents that weren't getting a lot of attention. And Greg Mitchell gave me a boost. And then eventually from there, I was hired to write for Fire Dog Lake, take over a column that had been there for civil liberties and national security coverage of those issues. And I committed myself to following the trial against Chelsea Manning, the court-martial against Chelsea Manning, as one of the few journalists that went there regularly to Fort Meade to cover those proceedings. And then that expanded out to covering the wider war on whistleblowers. I was given an opportunity to meet people like Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou, and others who have found themselves prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And then I gained this following that now I had to continue. Once Julian Assange was arrested and expelled from the Ecuador embassy, it was natural that I would return to this story and keep up this coverage. And this book is a guide. This book is intended for what we see looming ahead. It's unfortunate that it might get to this point, but extradition has been authorized by the United Kingdom's government. And so the only thing standing in between putting Julian Assange on a plane and putting him on trial in the Eastern District of Virginia right now is the fact that there is an appeals process that he still has to exhaust. It'll take a really long time. In itself, that is kind of a punishment by process. That's how I refer to it. But we need to be prepared in the U.S. to educate and make sure everyone's aware of all these issues that exist within this prosecution, why it should be dropped, why the charges should be dropped. And the fact is that because of the way he's prosecuted under the Espionage Act, there's a lot of evidence related to the way he's been mistreated and abused that will not be allowed in the courtroom. There's a lot of evidence related to the information that he disclosed and why he published the documents that will not be allowed to be part of proceedings just because that's how U.S. prosecutors make certain Espionage Act prosecutions unfold.
And just for those who might not recall, the connection, why this is in a sense one story, is because Chelsea Manning, as I believe she was a corporal in the military, released information which Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published. So in a sense, he's the journalistic outlet for the material that she released as a whistleblower. And that is, as I understand it, the origin of the case against him. But to me, Kevin, there are two cases being waged against Julian Assange. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. One is the legal case, and the other is the case in the court of public opinion. Mm-hmm. And to me, the legal case, as I understand it, reading your book and so on, which, by the way, I highly recommend, very, among other things, very readable, very informative. The legal case has to do with earlier revelations, but Assange has also been accused of, in the words of Mike Pompeo, operating I think he called it a hostile intelligence agency, or words to that effect. Yep. In other words, an outlet that was created to disseminate information, which is what has always been journalism's role, is now described as a hostile intelligence service. And that's a description, despite Mike Pompeo's association with Trump and so on, that seems to me to have been embraced by both parties and sort of consensus thinking within both of them. So I think if you ask the average Democrat as well as the average citizen about Julian Assange, I would get the sense that for many people, he's been convicted in the court of public opinion already. Does that jibe with your sense?
Yeah. So just let me quickly say that Chelsea was a private first class. Okay. That was her rank, and it is important to make clear because the New York Times especially is guilty of fudging the terminology in this case. So we need to be clear that Chelsea Manning was the source, had the documents, had access to the documents, provided them to Julian Assange, who as a publisher, performed the role of a journalist and made those documents available. You could even say he was a broker. He formed partnerships with several media organizations like the New York Times, The Guardian, and he's not really a source. He never had access to the material. It was provided to him. What you're saying is important. I think progressives have significant hangups over Julian Assange and whether they should support him. And they also probably feel that they would look at somebody like me and ask, why do you spend so much time on Julian Assange? Do you really think that his case is that important when it comes to press freedom? Aren't there other journalists that are under attack? Why are you only paying attention to him? And, rather than, take the bait and say that, like, I'm only myopically focused on Julian Assange, what I would say is that his case is one in which has ramifications for people throughout the world. But to your point of the fact that he's gone through this assassination of his character that has rubbed off and rubbed people the wrong way, that is intentional. That has made it easier for the Justice Department to be able to justify keeping these charges without dropping them. I think you look at the scope of outrage and condemnation from civil liberties and press freedom and human rights groups globally, and you wonder why they are discounted when, in other cases, they might actually hold some currency for the Biden White House. But they're ignoring those groups and they're ignoring people who speak out politically in other countries because of what has been able to be attached to Julian as a figure. Things related to the 2016 election in the publication of the Clinton campaign emails, arguing that he was boosting Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton's campaign, that he was somehow working for the Trump campaign, even though there is no evidence to support it. There were things said about him communicating with figures like Roger Stone. Well, Roger Stone was a liar, a total liar about what he knew. He claimed he knew when WikiLeaks was going to publish documents, and there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. And then you obviously have the sexual allegations that go back to Sweden, which is why he ended up seeking asylum in the Ecuador embassy in the first place. And that had people skeptical because, rightfully so. And we also went through a whole Me Too moment where people were coming forward and sharing their stories, but they looked past the due process violations that were rampant by the Swedish prosecution authority that, infringed on not only Julian Assange's rights, but the women who accused him of wrongdoing. And then, yes, Mike Pompeo labels WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service. That gets embraced by the Congress. It passed in, I believe, a national defense authorization bill while Trump was president. And the idea is that somehow WikiLeaks was working on behalf of Russia to publish this material to bring down Hillary Clinton. And that's something that should be entirely discredited because Special Counsel Robert Mueller did a huge high-profile investigation and never substantiated that WikiLeaks was performing this function for Russian intelligence.
So a couple of things about that, Kevin. One is, first of all, this label, which has now been sort of embraced, as I say, in a bipartisan way and among certain elites and so on, this characterization of WikiLeaks as a hostile, non-state intelligence service, in a sense, that's every autocrat's description of the press, isn't it? I mean, and to me, that's what this case in many ways is all about. Is about using Julian Assange as first of all, as an example to send a message to journalists everywhere who might want to publish state secrets that the public has an interest in knowing, by subjecting him to brutal psychological pressure, which we could discuss at more length, by, persecuting him in every way possible, by vilifying him, by, so I think that's a dimension of this. And I think it's, secondly, I think there's a hypocrisy in this because to me, the same U.S. government that celebrates independent journalists in states that we don't like, Iran or wherever, celebrate bloggers, celebrate online journalism as a bastion of freedom and criticize, rightfully, governments that suppress or punish them, but yet don't apply the same standard to publication online about our own government. So to me, it's there's the hypocrisy. Then the third is, you quote President Biden in here as saying, "I'm not convinced by Assange as a journalist. He may be something else." It seems to me, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I just wanted to get it out there. It seems to me that he says something to the effect of, it remains to be seen if he's a journalist. Well, if the government decides who's a journalist and who isn't, to me, we no longer have a free press at all. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, all that stuff I just threw at you. But
well, exactly, and it was a fleeting moment, but when there was a really crowded Democratic presidential primary in 2020, the New York Times actually included in their questionnaire for candidates one about this case and Julian Assange being charged under the Espionage Act. And in contrast to Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders himself actually made the point that the U.S. government shouldn't be in the business of deciding who is and is not a journalist, and objected to the Espionage Act prosecution. And so did Elizabeth Warren, I believe, and a few others. And so Joe Biden stood out with his ambiguous response to this of a very, very flimsily suggesting that, okay, it could be concerning, journalism is important, but then saying things that were very placating to the national security agencies about how information needs to be protected and how their interests should be protected. So I would bring up the fact that Evan Gershkovich right now is in Russia and has been detained by the government. And I think that this is a really key case for getting people to understand why Julian Assange should be free. And that might be difficult for some progressives to follow, but it goes like this. I was struck by the fact that the Russian that Russia's foreign intelligence agency there described Evan Gershkovich as someone who needed to be prosecuted because he was collecting state secrets. That was the allegation against Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal. And that's exactly what they say Julian Assange was doing as the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief. The accusation is that he was collecting state secrets from the U.S., soliciting them. His goal was to recruit people like Chelsea Manning, like Edward Snowden, and other people who worked in U.S. government agencies to leak sensitive information that could be used by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, go down the list, potentially to do damage to the United States. That's how they speak about Julian Assange. And so this is something that we have said since Julian Assange was put in handcuffs and dragged from the Ecuador embassy, that the problem with these Espionage Act offenses that have been leveled against Julian Assange is that the U.S. is claiming that they have the authority to enforce a U.S. domestic law against an Australian citizen who is not from the U.S., has no ties to the United States, should not be expected to protect U.S. classified information, never signed a non-disclosure agreement like Chelsea Manning, and yet he is being put through this extradition case and could be brought to the U.S. and put on trial. And that is no different than what Russia is doing. Russia is claiming the authority to in an authoritarian manner enforce its laws against a U.S. or a Western correspondent, somebody who shouldn't have to go through this process at all, someone who should not be expected to follow Russian laws. And that is the race to the bottom that we're seeing encouraged by this prosecution. The fact that regional powers are going to be able to target foreign correspondents and say, we're allowed to do that. That's what the United States did to Julian Assange.
No, I think that's a great point. And I would actually argue, while in no way defending what Russia's doing, it's totalitarian and awful against Evan, I would argue that the case against Assange is even less legitimate because Evan did whatever he did on Russian soil.
Yeah.
So they could make the case that Russian law applies. And my understanding is Julian Assange did his work outside the United States. So they're actually reaching out globally and pulling him in to punish him. But that gets us to...
Well, and Richard, if I could just quickly say, this is why I emphasize Joe Manchin's quote, where he says in a very bizarre, cringy manner that he wants to bring back Julian Assange to U.S. soil. I mean, I think maybe he was in the U.S. for like 1 or 2 days in his lifetime. He's never spent any lengthy amount of time here in the United States.
Yeah, the bring back is a strange, sort of modified perception of reality for sure. Let's talk a minute, Kevin, about the Espionage Act, because to me, the Espionage Act is the foundation for this prosecution. It was passed under Woodrow Wilson. And, I might say parenthetically that there's been a lot of long overdue historical revision of our understanding of Woodrow Wilson in terms of racism and other aspects of his personality. But the Espionage Act, to me, is a disgraceful episode in American history. By the way, my own grandfather, as a union organizer, was investigated under the Espionage Act, but nothing came of it. So I guess my question for you, we had, it seemed to go, if I recall correctly, quiescent for decades, and then Bush tinkered with it, and Obama really, pushed the accelerator to the floor on it. And then in comes this prosecution of Assange. But maybe I have it a little wrong. Maybe you can help me with that.
Yeah, and the Woodrow Wilson Center is a think tank that the Democrats, I believe, some pretty notorious foreign policy hawks have been a part of. And so there's been a kind of rebranding of Woodrow Wilson to make it seem like he wasn't as hostile to civil liberties and even human rights. I mean, when you look back to this era in the 1910s, early 1920s, not only were they passing the Espionage Act, but they also had a sedition act, a sedition law that was repealed after a few years. It didn't end up staying on the books. And they particularly were insecure about how many Americans were opposed to the U.S. being involved in World War I. And they felt the need to clamp down on it. And they were targeting people who were anti-war, going after labor organizers. They were also targeting alternative magazines or the alternative press that was using the Postal Service. They were finding ways to block their ability to share their publications with the public. And so, what I think is important for people to understand about the Espionage Act is that it has always been used to target people who were seeking to expose what the U.S. military was doing abroad, and to go after people who were challenging the way in which the U.S. chooses to protect its national security. And the myth is that it's just all about people who are spies, who are giving information, that it's intended to criminalize people who are going to provide secret information to someone who's an agent of a foreign power, or who's going to publish information with the intention to harm the United States, and then essentially they are betraying their country. But later on, it becomes something that particularly the Obama administration is using to target people who just publish classified information, who go to the press and seek to expose the way in which the global war on terrorism is being pursued, and how constitutional rights are being violated, how torture is being used by the CIA in interrogations, how the President Obama's administration is developing a kill list, is pioneering drone warfare and putting people on a list to target and assassinate them abroad without any trial or any charges or anything. In places where we haven't even declared a conflict, people were being executed. And so that is, I think, the crucial way that you see that if you go back from World War I and you draw a line all the way up to Julian Assange, it's consistent. So in that sense, there's not that much newness to Julian Assange's prosecution. I mean, along that line, we have the amazing hero and peace activist Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers whistleblower, who is, I think, the model for the case that the U.S. government wants to bring against people who are whistleblowers today when individuals are prosecuted under the Espionage Act. But now with Julian Assange, what they're signaling is that it doesn't have to stop at media sources. It could be the journalists or the publishers or editors themselves who are prosecuted.
Well, absolutely. And there are so many dimensions of this we could get into, and certainly Dan Ellsberg's one of them in terms of the same people who lionize Dan Ellsberg. That turns out to be conditional on the party of the president whose secrets he's revealing, it seems to be. But another important element of this story, even though perhaps not directly involved with the case, but in terms of the public perception of Julian Assange, is Russiagate. Mm-hmm. And you devote a chapter to Russiagate, still a bitterly contentious issue among progressives and Democrats and others very, still remaining enormous bitterness. The accusation that Julian Assange somehow worked with the Russians, although as you point out, there's no evidence of that, worked with the Russians to bring forward embarrassing information about Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. At a number of times when people like Paul Begala, Donna Brazil, and others have tweeted about this terrible thing that's happened, and Begala in particular, you work for a journalistic organization. I sort of tweeted to him, do you or don't you think that the public had a right to read this information once it became available? And none of them will ever answer that very simple question, which is, leaving aside for a moment the mechanism by which it got released, is this material in the public interest or is it not? So it seems to me what we have now is a large contingent of people on both sides of the aisle willing to argue, including members of the press, that the press should voluntarily suppress information that it's in the public interest to know. And to me, that's very disturbing. And to me, the Julian Assange case is deeply embedded in it, if not legally, then in terms of the public narrative. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and very briefly, I mean, it doesn't really speak to these allegations that he was working on behalf of Russia, because I think at this point, we can pretty well establish that that is a bad faith argument that has been leveled against WikiLeaks and Assange. Look at these people who you're mentioning, Begala, Donna Brazil, others. These are people who were invested in the Clinton campaign. They were invested in the establishment of the Democratic Party. They were directly threatened by the insurgent campaign of Bernie Sanders. And so when those documents were made available and they showed the extent to which the party was not, and I think people sometimes get it wrong. They get it inverted. What people should say is not that they were trying to suppress Bernie Sanders' campaign. No, what they were doing was they were trying to make it easier for Hillary Clinton to run her campaign so that she would not have to deal with a formidable primary challenger. And so they didn't know that it was going to be Bernie Sanders that would emerge, but they wanted to make sure that they were 99% certain that once she got to the Democratic National Convention, there wasn't going to be somebody who could command almost as much control of the Democratic Party as she was able to do. And so immediately they were making these allegations that the documents were forged. I remember that with the campaign chair, John Podesta, and others. There was never any evidence that there were forgeries published. They need to recognize, and I think you recognize this too, is that this information was in the public interest. People had a right to know that this is what was happening during a political primary. And in fact, don't take my word for it. Take the Southern District of New York Judge John Kodal, which I write about. I use him. He concludes this chapter in the book because the Democratic National Committee brought a lawsuit against Donald Trump, the Trump organization, against Russia, Russian nationals, and against WikiLeaks. And they claimed that they had done some kind of crime in publishing this hacked material. And John Kodal, who has some history going back to, I think, even the days of the Pentagon Papers, he knows James Goodall, who was the general counsel for the New York Times, who argued the Pentagon Papers case. John Kodal said that WikiLeaks had a First Amendment right to publish hacked materials and recognized that what they were doing was protected conduct, that this material was covered, and that, to the extent that there's no evidence that they had any role in hacking the material, in trying to steal the information that was private from the Clinton campaign, people have to allow for the fact that they were able to publish that material. But now, I'll just say as an aside here, in a more larger sense, beyond just the Assange case, we have a real difficult time right now with these social media platforms and with people in our government in convincing them that journalists should be allowed to share this material, much like leaked documents that are obtained from the NSA or CIA or whatever agency, much like the documents that were published by Jack Teixeira, this leaker who just got arrested, which we should all be allowed to share if they are made available on the internet. They object to the posting and publication of hacked materials, even if it's in the public interest.
And, it seems to me there's an inbuilt contradiction here in the sense that the legal argument against Assange, because of, I suspect, among other things, the judge's ruling you just cited, is that he didn't merely publish hacked materials, that somehow he conspired in the hacking, right? That's part of the case, which seems to me there's no evidence for, but it's kind of showing journalists, anybody who might want to practice journalism, that we have a legal workaround to get you if you try to do this, which is to make this claim. On the other hand, the narrative around Russia is all the people pushing it say, well, it was a standard hack and leak, which, by the way, they use that terminology as if it was something they all knew about beforehand, when I don't think any of them ever used the phrase standard hack and leak until this happened. And then they're just saying like, it's a classic thing that happens all the time. But if it's the Russians that are hacking and leaking, then it's not Julian Assange who's hacking. So the legal argument contradicts the public argument that somehow Julian Assange is a malefactor. But what it gets to in the end is, and maybe we can, sort of conclude with this, is a kind of liberal / media culture, a press culture, and a public, rank and file liberal mentality that says it's okay to suppress public information if we don't like the political implications of what might happen if it became known, see, for example, Biden, Hunter, or B, if, it's embarrassing. So we've had this bizarre kind of, from the days of Woodward and Bernstein and idealizing, whatever their limitation, idealizing crusading reporters, and the Church Commission in the 1970s looking into CIA misbehavior. We now have a liberal culture and a media culture, it seems to me, that exalts the intelligence agencies, who, as you quote rightly, Mike Pompeo said, were trained to lie, and considers them the arbiters of truth, and the people who reveal information, bring it to public attention, are somehow the bad guys in all of this. And it just seems to me like I woke up one day in bizarro world, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, but it seems to me your book is very much an important part of that conversation.
Well, they also want to have it both ways. They want to publish the scoops from this information that they think should not be available because they subscribe to all the claims that the government is making about why these sensitive secrets could do damage. They are quick to pile on the person who is responsible for making the unauthorized disclosures. And yet then they are making these headlines. Jack Teixeira, this Air National Guardsman who has been who's now the most recent Espionage Act prosecution, is a good example. But what is happening with him, leave aside the fact that he's probably not a whistleblower, but just look at what happened with the media's behavior. They were simultaneously running these major headlines about how U.S. intelligence was spying on allies, penetrated Russian intelligence, the way that South Korea was pressured to provide some weapons to Ukraine or whatever. And at the same time, they're getting on the phone with the FBI and helping them with any information to try and identify the source of the leak. So then they're acting like cops rather than journalists. But they did that with Julian Assange. They've done that with Julian Assange. They simultaneously publish these major stories about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They're still using these diplomatic cables to help people understand U.S. foreign policy. The Washington Post will run articles that reference cables when they're covering the war in Ukraine, when they're covering Venezuela and Latin America, other parts of the world. And at the same time, they're making pronouncements. The Washington Post editorial board declared WikiLeaks is not journalism. just acting like gatekeepers, blatant gatekeepers. And the problem for them is that Julian Assange does not identify with the collective agenda of the United States globally. They don't embrace U.S. foreign policy. Noam Chomsky would go even farther and say they don't embrace the goals and objectives of U.S. empire. WikiLeaks and Assange were global journalists that saw things how people see it in the global south, how people see it in Asia. They were open to ideas that they were being fed from the Middle East. So they don't just not publish information because it's going to make the US government look bad. They know that that could be a benefit to millions of people who don't deserve to have the systematic human rights abuses and don't deserve to live under occupation and don't deserve to live under these regimes that were supported in Egypt and Tunisia and other parts of the globe by the United States.
No, well said. And additionally, national security reporters for the Washington Post aren't going to find themselves at a cocktail party with Julian Assange, and they may very well with a CIA director somewhere in Georgetown. So before I let you go, Kevin, just one quick, what's the next step for Julian Assange in his trial?
Right now, we're waiting to find out if he's going to get an appeal hearing in the United Kingdom. And if that is granted, then he gets to go and he gets to argue that his press freedom rights have been violated, that they were not properly considered when the UK court authorized his extradition and then the UK government authorized his extradition. And so that would be the next phase. But beyond that, I just ask people who are listening to recognize that he is a father. He has 2 children. He has a wife. He would like to be with his family. And he has been denied bail for all 4 years, even though this is a nonviolent crime we're talking about. He's been jailed with terrorists in a high security prison in London. And that is by design. The UK is doing that at the behest of the US government. We just marked the 4th anniversary of him being thrown in Belmarsh.
Well, very well said. And they can find your work at shadowproof.com, right?
Well, the best place to go, I would send them to thedissenter.org, THEDISSENTER.org, which I send out routine and frequent updates on Julian Assange's case.
What was that again?
The Dissenter?
Thedissenter.org. Okay.
Thedissenter.org.
Okay. And the book again, my guest again is Kevin Gosztola. And pronounce that for me. I'm sorry.
Kevin Gosztola.
Yeah, okay, I got it right. Okay. Guilty of Journalism, the Political Case Against Julian Assange. I encourage you to read it. And Kevin, first of all, thank you for writing it. Thank you for the years of great reporting. And thanks for coming on the program. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.